Hello and welcome to the webinar. This is Ion IVD's webinar on the infectious disease IVD market. And it's based on our report that was published in September, our IVD Market Review Report. We're going to talk about many things today, but foremost, I want to talk about $21.3 billion. That's the amount of new revenue that's going to be created from 2024 to 2035, the forecast period of our report, in selling infectious disease IVD products. Before we think of that as just profit, let's remember that's money that's earned in disease treated, contagious thwarted, doctor visits made more meaningful by a test, sepsis hours reduced, something we're going to get into today. It's not just profits made by a company or salaries paid. It's very important, but that's the amount of revenue, that's the opportunity that's available. To whom? Well, here are some of the top companies in infectious disease IVD. None of these names should be too unfamiliar to you. Abbott and their Alinity systems, also their ID Now POC systems, bioMérieux, which has become wisely a specialist in this infectious disease area, Siemens Healthineers, Thermo, Biored, BD, specialists in traditional, ID, AST, and novel systems involving mass spec and things like that, Kydal Ortho, and their point-of-care immunoassay systems, increasingly molecular systems, QIAGEN, Grifols in blood banking, and Cepheid, pioneer in point-of-care testing. Roche, of course, is heavily into this market as it is the number one IVD company. But these companies are not alone. They're joined by near 100 companies participating in the infectious disease market and earning that revenue, that $21.3 billion, including companies like Randox, if you're talking about quality control, Mindray, number one company in China, T2 Biosystems, we'll talk about them a little later with the Lyme disease test, SD Biosensor, really making its way in a very promising way during the COVID epidemic. Everly Well selling at-home kits. Bruker increasingly not only selling mass spec for quite a long time operating in IVD, although it's primarily a life science company, but recently buying that Elite Tech purchase, which puts it into all sorts of in vitro diagnostic testing. ChemBio, leaders in emerging diseases, Seegene, multiplexing tests before a lot of companies were. Altona Diagnostics, not, these aren't companies to sleep on. There's some regional players like J. Mitra and company in India to be aware of, Diasorin and companies like that. Let's talk a bit about our agenda today. First of all, I haven't introduced myself, but I am Bruce Carlson. I'm the head of Ion IVD. I edit the newsletter that you can subscribe to on LinkedIn or at ionivd.com. I've been in the IVD market research marketplace, if you will, for about 18 years. I was previously with Calorama Information. One of the things that I've noticed during the time that I've been in the business is how important infectious disease has been over other types of testing for stable, consistent growth and for revenue that can be competed for by a multitude of companies. So we're going to talk about all of that today. First of all, the market, what, where, how. Are we back to pre-COVID levels? That's a phrase you hear a lot. We'll talk about that a bit. Sepsis as an issue, respiratory panels and the increasing growth that are being seen there, emerging infections driving the market. China, if there's time, LTDs, population, and if there's time, Q&A. You have a Q&A button on your console, and if you'd like to ask a question, please do. I will get to questions after the presentation because we have a little bit to go through, of course. I do want to note that your organization can purchase the report this webinar is based on. Published in September, over 230 pages, hundreds of data points, 21 countries and regions. Within each of those countries, we have 11 sub markets, all of it going out to 2025 in the case of products, and 2035 in the case of countries of the world market. 10 major disease categories within each, 8 to 15 sub markets. Molecular immunoassay, point of care. We have breakouts of those types of tests. We have top companies and also companies to watch. Also want to let you know about our next webinar, which will be held on December 4th, 2 p.m. A different webinar from this one. This one's going to primarily talk about one market, infectious disease, but this webinar we'll have a group of 4 experts that are going to talk about very cutting edge trends, the type of things that don't normally get discussed. We're not just going to talk about lab developed tests, say, or the market in China, things that may be off your radar. That's December 4th coming up, so we'll be advertising that. Look out for that. Okay, with that, what we're here for. Size of the infectious disease market, there's $39 billion in the market today, selling in vitro diagnostic tests for infectious disease, all sorts of diseases. We have here a breakout of the rest of, COVID-19 and the rest of the market. It's worth taking a little look at, as you get the question often, are we now at back to pre-COVID-19 levels? Well, we've seen decline in COVID revenue, certainly from where you saw it in 2020, 2021. There's a tendency to think, hey, now we're back to 2019. I don't think so, however. I believe that there have been fundamental changes that have taken place in the market, and there is no going back to 2019. And most of it's positive for infectious disease. The declining revenues in COVID that you'll see here obviously are not. But in 2024, as you can see on the chart, we're largely past that kind of, say, revenue overhang that you might have been obtaining from COVID revenues and the decline in COVID revenue sales, and Wall Street noticing the big companies. We're kind of past that point where most companies, when they report their 2024 revenues, COVID will just be a small part of their reporting. The market for infectious disease is slightly higher than in 2019. It's about 9 billion higher. And not only that, there's been install-based increases. Look at the Roche Copus large molecular systems, from 750 to 1900. ID now, 1900 to 75,000, and possibly even more at this time. Greater acceptance of panel testing. It's not as much of a fight as it was prior to the pandemic. BARDA funding, government agencies realizing the importance of testing. All of these things are factors that you have to consider moving out forward in the market. And sure, COVID will decline, but it hasn't gone away. It's not going to go away. This isn't SARS 2003. It will remain on menus, and it particularly as a rule-out test. And if you look at the recent St. Louis Veterans Affairs study, you find that COVID was found to be 35% more deadly in the patients studied, and it was a study of thousands of VA patients, 35% more deadly than the flu. So it's something that's going to have to be tested for in the future. It remains on the menu. What are the growth factors and inhibitors in the market? Every time we look at a market or you see a piece of a market analysis, these two things are weighing, right? If we didn't have it, then markets would grow 100% each year. But there are inhibitors to any market. In our case, we mentioned one is COVID testing will decline. Single target lab-based testing will, not grow as fast as other markets. There's consolidation in the industry, both in the IVD industry and among labs. And you're seeing the large labs purchase outpatient operation at hospitals and purchase other labs, less customers. Payer and regulation activity, of course, is an inhibitor of the market, and just your mature test categories. What goes against that? Point of care testing and infectious disease is probably your better category for convincing people of the merit of point of care because of the need to diagnose an infection quickly. Innovation in the market. We're going to talk about that in three areas in the time that we have. Developing nations, panels, age and population. Age and population is always present. If that's all that it was, this market wouldn't grow very much because, as we see in the inhibitors, payers and regulators can be good at finding ways to sort of dampen down pricing. But you also have emerging infections. We'll get into that in a few as well, where that's driving the market up. That means the $60.3 billion market in 2035, and that represents a 4.5% compound annual growth rate. If you just want to look at it, that's from 2019. If you want to look at it from 2024, it's a 4.1% compound annual growth rate. What does it mean in terms of the overall IVD market? Where does this exist? Well, look at it this way. Overall IVD market will be slow at growth, maybe 2 to 3% over this forecast period in 2035. That could even be changed if, say, a policy like PAMA is not delayed again and things like that. So your infectious disease are seeing a higher growth rate than the overall market. Where is the revenue going to be earned? Well, so let's start with where are the infectious disease cases? And although the large market is in the United States, there's probably only about 2% of cases in the United States. It's notable that more than a fourth of the world's infectious disease cases will be in China or India. And so these remain important target markets. And when we go to our geographic chart, and I want to tell you that in the actual report, the infectious disease IVD report, we have actual, growth estimates for all of these. Here we're just saying, sort of like the range. Not surprisingly, you're going to see high to mid to high single-digit growth, China, India, Latin America. Look at India, we see the population, the fact that it's a market culture, the fact that while there are local providers in some cases, foreign competition will play a very important role in these markets. So it's going to grow faster than, say, the United States or North American markets or European markets. But, you know, if we were 10 years ago in 2014, we'd be talking about double-digit growth. So it's definitely declined, and just merely being an international player alone is no longer a growth strategy. It is just simply part of the equation to be an IVD company. Not surprisingly, there's more value to be found, more revenues to be found in the developing world. So here we have 5.7% in the developing world, contrasted with 4% in developed markets. What types of tests does this revenue that we've been talking about, that these companies we've been talking about selling, that these geographies we've been talking about are going to buy, what type of tests are we talking about? Well, specifically, that's going to be in our report. But I want to tell you that our report lists 28 areas with higher than average IVD market growth, higher than the average for infectious disease IVD sales. 28 areas. Here's a few. Respiratory panels, hospital-acquired infection at the point of care, torch, even though torch is a more mature type of infectious IVD test and a lab-based setup, point of care torch will grow. Tuberculosis testing, an increased demand for that. West Nile, Chagas, sepsis, an important area. What's driving it? Let's talk about trends. And in the time that we have, there's three trends that I thought I could best isolate that'll give you at least a little picture of what's going on in infectious disease testing and what could actually change even the market estimates that we're talking about. And three of them are sepsis, respiratory, particularly panel testing, and emerging infections. Let's start with sepsis. I'll take a quick break just to see if we've got any chats or anything like that. I don't see right now. Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Okay, fair enough. There's me. I'll put myself back on the screen. Um, okay, 1.7 million US cases of sepsis per year and a third of hospital deaths. That means that sepsis cannot be ignored. It will continue to be an important part of infectious IVD, an important problem to solve. 38 billion in cost. Every hour that a patient has sepsis increases their chance of death by 7.6%. That is gold in a sense for a good solution, key word, good solution for reducing, detecting sepsis and getting the patient to proper treatment quickly, proper steps. A Danish study recently published showed that one half of sepsis patients live less than 2 years. Less than 2 years. That just increases. It's just another reason why it's important to know that a patient has sepsis and know it well. We tend to think about sepsis as a US phenomenon a lot when we're discussing markets. Not everyone, but I think that's because of the CMS and various impacts on hospital payments and the like associated with sepsis. But let's remember, it's a global disease, okay? And 19.7% of global deaths are a result of sepsis, so a very important problem. That leads to a market here, 2 billion plus market. We anticipate 5.6% growth, so higher than the infectious disease market that we just talked about earlier. Not surprising. And 2 billion is a hefty number for sepsis testing solutions. But I want to make clear when we talk about markets and we have numbers on a page, and there's a lot of market research reports out there. I don't have to tell you, there's a lot of people doing webinars. By the way, thank you for attending ours because I know your time's valuable. I just wanted to make the point that just because there's a robust market for someone does not mean customers are satisfied. And I think it's the case with sepsis if we look at providers as the customers. There's acceptance of sepsis testing. There's a feeling that if I think the patient has sepsis, then lactates and procalcitonin helps me, CRP helps me to make that diagnosis and confirm it. But there's not satisfaction with these tests. There was a recent article in CAP today that in the last issue that I advise everyone to read on this topic, and they had some provider opinions. And for instance, just one provider's feedback, but representative is, I may not need to know the exact cause. I don't need to know the exact virus. It may be in an emergency department, but I need to rule out other conditions like a heart condition, and I need to know what to do next. And that's kind of what you're seeing. There's a quest for better tests. A preference would be for something that says yes, no to sepsis. All right, a troponin for sepsis is the way Cap today put it, and I think that's artful and correct. Companies are trying. Innovation grows markets. We don't talk about a 5.6% growth, which for IVD right now is pretty high as things go. We don't talk about that without innovation occurring. So you have IntelliSep, Cytovale, a lot of people looking at this test where they apply pressure to cells, kind of cytometry test. And it will provide a easy to use 3-band, like low probability, middle, high probability of sepsis. Interesting. Hematology systems are coming to the rescue. I don't think I would have thought, 10 years ago that I'd be talking about hematology too much in an infectious disease IVD webinar, maybe. But if you do the monocyte distribution with and just kind of look at the characteristics of monocytes, then maybe there's a way to tell if the patient has a sepsis condition doing that. And that's becoming an increasing selling point for Beckman Coulter is just one of the companies, but it's a particular useful test that some have found. It's not alone. I mean, sepsis is an area where something as common as blood pressure in determining sepsis is argued about and debated by various medical journals, medical authorities. So there's a lot of fast movement in this field. You're seeing people use, say, heparin binding protein assay, cytokines, endotoxins, What's the best answer here to determine things? The debate over the effectiveness of these markers continues, and while it does, that provides for a market. Double diagnostics is a phrase used by our partner, House Sound Research. And they have a great report, by the way, on sepsis. It is available on our ionivd.com website. It's dedicated, it's just sepsis, it's detailed. But one of the things that one of the points made in House Sound Research is that, there's a tendency towards double diagnostics. In other words, a new test doesn't come on the scene in IVD and replace all the old tests. I mean, sometimes it does, but that's usually not the way it works, especially with something as potentially expensive and dangerous to patient outcomes as sepsis. There's a tendency to use the old test plus the new test, which really boosts the market. And look out in the future for combinations of tests and maybe dedicated systems that can do that, like a panel for sepsis that can do that to become the practice norm. We have to talk about respiratory panels when we're talking about what's fueling all those numbers you had on the page earlier, Bruce. You know, respiratory panels are proving growth. Just Q3 2024, you see bioMérieux had a fantastic, at least quarterly result, 8% growth overall. Their respiratory panel sales increased 14%. Cepheid, while Danaher doesn't get that talkative in their annual reports like that, I note that demand for respiratory tests, customers stocking up for the upcoming season, you see in there. And since they're a major provider of panels and one of the original panel test innovators, you see what's going on just in the Q3s. But overall, we expect that between 2019 and 2035, 14% growth in the respiratory panel category. Why is that? Because that's a lot higher. That's three times higher than the rest of infectious disease testing. First is menu expansion. You've already seen the menu on these panel tests expand from only having COVID to only having COVID and flu, different types of flu, and then having RSV. And that menu expansion has helped. You want strep as well to rule that out. What are possible expansions? There's some tests that have 21 respiratory conditions. One to look out for might be human metapneumovirus. 10 to 12% of illnesses in children. Symptoms look like a cold. It also could affect adults. Like, for instance, if someone has asthma and gets this disease, we're going to have to consider oxygen therapy as a possibility if you know that the condition's advanced. And that's why what's driving respiratory panels when they came out, and it's still a concern, everyone was worried about payers. Like, are they going to pay for all of this? And that's a legitimate question. And there are payer strategies to limit, what they're paying and they're out. But what's convincing some of the use of these panels, you got to look at patient satisfaction. So after a provider visit, patients are going to fill out a survey in many cases. You want, as a patient, to know what is it that I had. Your family members want to know that really helps a patient visit before you even get to how it helps the doctor. I also would note, and it might be more futuristic, but if we're going to start to use more genetic treatments for diseases, you're going to have to know the specific disease the patient had and not just be guessing or ruling out a few things. So these expanded panels become important. I do notice also parainfluenza. It causes what we call the croup in most cases, and a flu vaccine is utterly ineffective in reducing that particular condition. Why do I bring those two up? That's what providers seem to cite what's coming into the clinic commonly. In addition to menu expansion, respiratory panels are increasing because of growth from innovation. And I have 4 examples here, very recent. The bioMérieux sore throat. Not only is it a real marketing effort in syndromic testing to put that syndromic forward. This is a sore throat test, but it's also aimed at the small clinic. It's CLIA waived. QIAstat Mini, which the thing about QIAstat that in addition to many good attributes of the test, is that CT values that can be used to assess maybe a viral load. So you're getting a little beyond, am I sick? What do I have? How sick am I? When will I recover? And those are all maybe important pieces of information to know. Robust Covus Flex, interesting test, 12 test system, and Roche owns PCR. So they're able to, I don't know if everyone, I guess that's well known, but they're able to improve it. And they had some technology. They had their own in-house sciences experimenting with it, where if you change the temperature at the time the test is conducted, you can increase the capacity at the test. And this result at this temperature is this disease, that kind of thing, using specific reagents for that purpose. And so they've expanded the capacity of PCR, in this case, to 12 tests. That's going to be interesting to see. Also interesting to see is the Liaison Plex, which is an opt-out test model. That's my words, not theirs. In other words, we're going to test for 21 conditions, somewhere around there, and you can pay for 3, you can pay for 5, you can pay for 7. We have the information, but we're giving you as much information as you pay for. It's the IVD company becoming a database company, which is such an interesting approach in a way, because that's what database companies do. I shouldn't say this partially as a database company myself, is that we have the information. How much we're going to give you depends on the license, and this is what they're doing. It's going to be interesting to see if that concept expands beyond just this situation where we have payers that may not want to pay for all the tests. We have providers that may not want all that testing. And all that, give me signal, not noise is a factor there too. Or if it's just, going to be this type of test that it's used for, or this becomes a larger concept. Those 4 aren't the only respiratory tests. So you have growth in any market comes from competition. More models, more brands. It just tends to drive up a market, at least in a forecast period. Gene, look out for that. We have Abbott has respiratory panels as well as BD, Hologic, and Pfizer has a home test that's a panel. And Cepheid has been a very present market, not only in small POC systems, but you also have to look at Cepheid as a kind of a benchtop lab capacity expander too with their modular systems. So this is growing, and it's not going to be limited here. BARDA has funded studies on respiratory panels, which indicates there's probably models coming around the way. I saw in the news recently that Credo Biosciences Singapore is planning to enter the U.S. market, and there's other collaborators getting together to develop panels. Why wouldn't they? Look at that growth in the market, that's going to attract a lot of competition. So it's going to get crowded. What about non-respiratory panels? What about all these other panels, Bruce? Well, our report covers GI, respiratory, STI panels, hepatitis panels, others. We in detail, as well as we provide numbers for those respiratory panels as well in the report. I want to talk about emerging infections. This is always a driver of infectious disease, and particularly as infectious disease cases reach the news media. We just recently had a scare about equine encephalitis, bird flu, and Mpox have recently reached the news. Every time that happens, the American public is thinking about testing again, and it will make that payer or that government a little bit more hesitant to do something like, say, a PAMA to reduce the healthcare reimbursements and that. And more to the point, if the outbreak gets to a certain point, there's going to have to be testing, at least to rule out, like you take bird flu. Well, these flu tests generally right now don't test for bird flu, but they rule out, in a sense, if they find regular flu, it can be used in the differential diagnosis. So a lot of testing is going to have a role outside of just single target test. But generally, the inevitability of new infections is what drives this market. This is why we decided to focus on this area versus, say, cancer diagnostics, which are still important, of course, or autoimmune or things like that. It's a constant moving target. I like to bring up, or I don't like to bring up, that you take a disease like West Nile. It did not exist in the United States until the 1990s. First cases in New York. Then by the next year, it's in Colorado. All right. So when I was in college, this was not a disease that if you mentioned it in America, no one would look at you with a straight face. And now, just in 2021, 101 people die in Arizona because they had an unusual record rain. So yes, and that tells you this is climate connected. I think it's climate connected. I think a lot of these diseases are. I think a lot of diseases are globalization connected, just the ability to travel and increase in the population. So more contagion spreading. It's interesting when we talk about global warming, say climate change and West Nile disease, there's a tendency to think that this disease is going to spread because, say, there's warmer temperatures, but you have to look at the variable temperatures as well. So it's not just that the temperature is getting warmer, but that it's throwing off the birth cycle, it's throwing off the immune system of the vector of the mosquitoes. And so I would expect not only more testing of patients in something like West Nile, but also testing of mosquitoes. And you see like Co-Diagnostics with their product to do things just like that. I'm just going to see if we have a Q&A. There's something let's see here. I'll just read David's question and comment. Bruce, with respect to respiratory panels, the payers are pushing back on labs running anything more than the 5-assay viral panel if ordered from a family med or urgent care physician. If the patient gets a bill from the lab indicating that the test was denied coverage from their healthcare insurance company, their satisfaction with the clinician will be adversely impacted. I do think you're right, and I should qualify in the scope of what we're talking about. It's a lot to get into, but and so we do some shortcutting, but since you brought it up, and I'll put this away, what about what I think about as a sicker patient? So not all, when you're getting beyond the 5-test panel, yeah, I think the patient has to be a sicker patient for that to work. But when that is the case, I think you'll see value in some of these larger tests. And again, if there is a future where there's more genetic treatments, again, knowing that you'll have to know that specific in order to almost have a kind of companion test for that condition. Thank you. What I really appreciate about that, David, is at least lets me know someone's watching, which is always good when you're doing these kind of webinars. I have to talk about Lyme disease. The basic truth, is only 30,000 cases, say, in the US each year. But even the CDC says there's the actual number, something like 476,000. So there are untested cases. Everyone thinks it's the bullseye rash, but I think here, for those of us who know a bit in the industry, we've heard before, you see testing companies advertising it. It's not either, sometimes not a rash at all. And some of those rashes you could see on the screen don't look very bullseye to me. So a patient, for many reasons, may not know that they even experienced it, and yet it's causing a lower quality of life in a lot of cases. There's many companies that do Lyme testing, so I don't just want to single out T2, but I do mention them because this disease for them has sort of, literally put them back on the market. They were delisted, or they were threatened with delisting, and the success of this test helped them to get their spot back in the stock market. So it's been very successful, and they've developed some partnerships. And they're not the only one. You're going to see an increase in this. You're going to see an increase not just in the standard approach to testing, but in new systems that can give a single target type answer. Let's look at some other trends. Okay, population growth, the LTDs, China. That's what we'll have time for today. And can't see it perhaps, but Population growth is a growth trend. Okay, that's a positive for the market. Not just population growth, but the aging of the world population. It's not just the US, it's not just Japan, it's countries like Uruguay. It's even China. It's countries even in Africa in some cases, though it's the will be the youngest continent. There's still an aging population. All this adds up to 65 plus, which is a good one to look at for healthcare activities. 900 million in the world, 67 million in the US by 2027. More injuries, more need for medication, more infectious disease, more surgeries that will perhaps lead to a need for increased testings, more hospital visits, more doctor visits, all of the things that build a market. The other two, I think, are consolidation trends, and I'll get into that a bit. We'll talk about lab developed tests. Look, I mean, here's the only place where I can insert that we had an election yesterday. And an election like that might change federal policy, but right now labs have to comply with the FDA rules. So we can speculate all we want about what might happen. This is what's in place. As of now, lab developed tests are a medical device. Um, and there's a tendency to think this is about autoimmune, this is about cancer, but it is important for infectious disease. For instance, there's something like 80 listed lab developed tests for university medical centers and private centers across the country. The American Society of Microbiology has spoken out against regulation of LTDs, and the ADLM says that 48% of labs might discontinue tests. If this takes place, it's adverse to the market. Why? Well, you may be able to develop IVDs for some of these rarer conditions, and certainly there are Mpox tests already being approved and marketed. But don't forget that IVD manufacturers also sell reagents and other equipment to labs who are producing lab developed tests. And that's not just an infectious disease all over. That's the point I point out, others have pointed out as well. That's important to look at. We just don't know the effects of that yet because it's never been clear the market for those sales, but it's certainly present. Oh, and why is it consolidation? I think anything like the LTD regulation, any regulatory activity really, is consolidation positive because what companies can afford, and in this case, what laboratories can afford is the larger ones, larger university medical centers, and even some of them can't. So that's possibly a trend that could be consolidation positive. Let's look a bit at China and some things to think about. It is one of the larger growth markets internationally, even with all of the kind of talk about trade wars and things like that. You see in vitro diagnostics companies have long participated in China, and it's not it the talk that you hear in the news media doesn't reflect what's going on and with some of the major IVDs. But there are things or trends going on within China that are important. Volume-based purchasing is something to keep looking at. Okay, so it's been mostly at the provincial level for diagnostics. For other devices, it's been national. So that's something to think about. So far, it's been kept there. A worry for some companies, for larger companies, it may be actually a positive thing to secure markets and have direct contact with customers. General China IVD market conditions, I just wanted to point out, while some vendors report brisk sales, there are other vendors who report that customers may be waiting. So if the Chinese government offers a stimulus program, and that might be good for the market, some customers hold out and wait for that stimulus. And so you have like a bad quarter before that. Two initiatives to keep an eye on are Buy China, where they're encouraging domestic manufacturing, and Healthy China, where they're encouraging a shift to lower tiered hospitals, to rural clinics, new rural hospitals, and things like that. Healthy China should be market positive, particularly for makers of point of care. Buy China, it really depends. And you see the large IVD concerns, a Roche, a bioMérieux, they're going to manufacture parts of their product or their products in China so that they qualify as a domestic manufacturer. In fact, it's unlikely that Chinese domestic company would completely replace the need for foreign in vitro diagnostic companies. But it is consolidation positive because what companies can afford to participate, say, in a VBP program or in a buy China type situation in purchasing a factory in China, right? It's going to be the large manufacturers. So, given the size of the market, this is possibly an IVD industry consolidation trend. Okay, I covered everything that I wanted to cover. I can cover in the scope of this. I have a few questions. Let me see if there's something we can address. Um, 65 plus, more chronic conditions. Totally correct. Someone saying you occasionally cut out. So sorry about that. Didn't realize that was going on. Very sorry. I do want to point out that your organization can purchase the report that this webinar is based on. Hundreds of data points, 21 countries and regions within each, 20 diseases, molecular immunoassay, top companies to watch. So it really provides a resource that is much more than what we can discuss in the webinar. And it's, of course, it's available for global license. Prices are reasonable, if we're not excessive versus the industry for market research reports. Right now, it is the only report that I and IVD, in other words, myself and my analyst team, do. We only work on infectious disease at the current time. With our partners, though, we can provide almost any in vitro diagnostics market. We can provide strategy advice, and we have subscriptions that can enable your organization to have access to scores of reports if you purchase one of those subscriptions. And that's available through partners that we trust and work with. With that, I want to thank you very much for attending the webinar. Remember, December 4th, we'll have the Cutting Edge Trends webinar. And so many of you stayed with me. I really do appreciate that. I know your time is valuable. And with that, I'll end the webinar.